repulsing the COVID-19 pandemic through a massive vaccination drive while digging the economy out of an abyss. These are expected to be the priorities in President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address this evening. But the how of it all is what many will be looking for, with the feeling growing that promises and grand plans lacking in specificity just won't cut it. The President is expected to anchor his speech on his South Africa Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, which he launched in October last year. Well, joining us now is independent analyst Khaya Sithole to unpack it all and sort of look forward to what we can expect. Khaya, when President Ramaphosa takes to the podium at the National Assembly, he should be saying, fellow South Africans, the state of our nation is ... Complete the sentence for me, please.
An absolute disaster. And I think the reality, of course, is that there has to be an acknowledgement that long before the pandemic, which will no doubt feature prominently in his speech, South Africa's socio-economic indicators were on the downward spiral. We hadn't managed to find a blueprint for solving the unemployment crisis, for example. We hadn't found a blueprint for fixing our education crisis. We hadn't found a blueprint for cleaning up the civil service in a manner that would have at least led to less money being stolen during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. We hadn't found the economic blueprint that was going to explain to us how we're going to move ourselves away from junk status. So there's no point in pretending that we were living in a utopia with only just the coronavirus pandemic to be the great interruption. And I think it's important for him to acknowledge the fact that we didn't know what the solutions were before then, but now we're even less clued up on what needs to be done because there's been this external interruption that nobody could have predicted at this stage last year, or at least no one could have foreseen what the impact would have been. So I think if he's going to be offering us a dose of reality, that is really where he should start.
But hang on, Khaya, you talk about not having a plan on how to dig us out of this economic abyss. Isn't the South Africa Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan exactly that, the tool we need to dig our way out?
No, mainly because there must be a distinction that must be understood by all of us between a plan and a piece of paper. And the distinction there is that a plan is something that is then complemented by actual actions, tangible outcomes, milestones, reviews and previews. And what we've seen is that the government has mastered the art of putting things on paper, documenting them, whether you call it GEA, whether you call it ASKISA, or whether you call it the new Economic Recovery Plan, or whether you even call it the President's latest vanity project, which seems to be this infrastructure plan. All of those exist in paper. Whether we should then give them the status of calling them plans would seek to elevate them into something that are implementable and actionable. And for a government that has proven that there exists a glaring gap between it writing something on a piece of paper and it acting on it, I think we may as well start trying to draw the distinction between pieces of paper and actual plans, of which there aren't enough.
You know, Khaya, you say that, and it's really depressing, actually, to hear. I don't know why I'm laughing. But let's be fair. The Ford Motor Plant, massive infrastructure bill just outside SONA that was announced just weeks ago. We also know about the big Silverton multi-level infrastructure plan there. So there are things happening. The President has promised to implement, and in a very difficult year. Don't you think you should cut him a little slack?
The wonderful thing about the fact that you are able to recall those is precisely because there are so few of them. And the reality here is that if you go and interrogate the essence of what even those plans are, these are things that have been initiated by the private sector that has said, in spite of the bottlenecks that the government imposes on the private sector, in spite of the bottleneck that the government has imposed by refusing to release spectrum, for example, and in spite of the bottlenecks imposed by the government's inability to actually explain what the country's economic recovery blueprint is going to be, we are going to go ahead and invest. So we should not then elevate this to be an indication that the world of business and investors have bought into some magical, blueprint that Ramaphosa has put together. That simply hasn't been the case. Had that been the case, I would then take you back to his first investment summit, for example, and say, well, let us look at the pledges and the commitments that were made. How many of them have translated into actual, digging and building? How many of them have translated into jobs? And the answer, unfortunately, is that there aren't many. So that exception that you highlighted, well, that is precisely the problem. It is a world of exceptions because there isn't a government that has been able to open up its arms and say, these are the sacrifices we're making in order to ensure that as many more people can be absorbed into the job market, and we're going to create or cut off all the, the pitfalls that we've created ourselves. And until we get that, we are going to be talking about yet another exception in 12 months' time.
Khaya, what would surprise and delight you to hear tonight?
A sense of courage, and a sense of courage means that at some point in time this president has to make peace with the fact that the way the political architecture of the ANC has operated is probably no longer fit for purpose in light of the issues and the problems that you're trying to solve as a country. So if it turns out that one of the key issues is the fact that you need to restructure ESCOM and make it more effective and more efficient, then you need to make the tough decisions that are going to get you there. If it turns out that the board of the SABC insists that the only way it can be profitable, the only way it can be sustainable and not rely on bailouts is for it to implement a plan that the board and only the board is empowered to do so, then you should not be sending an emissary in the form of a minister to then block that. You should not be sending the Secretary General of your party to make promises to workers that cannot be supported because the money just isn't there. So if this president could finally exhibit some courage, and the courage associated with him saying, I understand what the political issues are, I understand what the social issues are, I understand what my alliance partners want, but my responsibility is to the country at large and not just to a party, and this is what I'm putting forward. This is what I'm going to do, and whatever the political consequences to me may be, then that's the type of courage that we've been looking for. 3 years down the line, there's little evidence that the man has even an understanding of what that courageous plan ought to be.
Lastly, Khaya, talk to us about the issue of state-owned enterprises as one of the many threads that we can pull at in as far as improving the economy and fixing the country's finances goes. What should he be saying that he hasn't said already about fixing the SOEs? I mean, in last year's SONA, he talked about rationalizing these SOEs, talked about, for instance, some 2.8 billion rand in fixing commuter rail in the country. What more can be said?
I'm led to believe that we should actually start referring to them as state-strangled enterprises. And the reason I refer to them as state-strangled enterprises is that at the end of the day, we do have documented history of the boards and the executive leaders of these institutions saying, hey, you've given us a mandate to run and turn this entity around into profitability, so therefore we are saying this is what needs to be done in order for us to get there. And for a person like Pravin Gordhan, for example, to then go and interfere in a wage settlement that had been proposed by Phakamani Hadebe at ESCOM, for example, for someone like Pravin Gordhan to insist that we must bail out SAA in spite of the lacking economic fundamentals out there, means that the government does more strangling of these state enterprises than enabling them. So I think at some point in time, if you're going to say that properly qualified and competent individuals have been appointed to run these institutions, we need to see that autonomy translating into them making the difficult calls and not having to worry about that the political fallout that Ramaphosa or Pravin Gordhan or anyone else is worried about is actually going to lead to them being shuffled out of their jobs. We've seen far too many instances of that, and I think there's instability in the state and in those state-strangled enterprises that emanates for that is something that Mr. Ramaphosa in particular must be held to account for, because he's been part of this architecture for much more than the last 3 years.
Independent analyst Khaya Sithole, thank you for your insights this evening.